So this is my 2025 OE experience and my guidance to others. This is concerning Eastern monarchs. When raising wild monarchs from eggs that would otherwise be mowed, OE is by far the biggest loss of monarchs, save mowing losses. So always test for OE, and a single OE infected butterfly can infect several generations of monarchs. So this is a brief outline of this presentation, and it basically goes into why OE as opposed to what is OE. So hopefully you have knowledge and experience with OE in the past, and this is more into questions around why. And so it's a little deeper dive. The OE parasite has co-evolved with monarchs for 1 to 2 million years. So there's a balance between the two, the host and the parasite. Parasite can't be too strong to wipe out the host, and it can't be too weak that it can't survive in the host. So there's a happy balance that has to happen between the parasite and the host. Some of the factors affecting OE would include the immune system, temperatures, moistures, and certain plants. Factors affecting the population decline, which is often a concern with monarchs. Is OE a problem? Are GMO herbicides problems? Are moisture and temperatures problems? Factors affecting OE infection rate in the migratory generation. The migratory generation is grown in September mostly. So it's interesting to look at that month in particular for moisture and migration path, etc. Then we'll get into the 2025 season OE data that I have and some statistics. Also mention some tips and tricks around leaf bleaching, cage bleaching, tracking September monarchs, making sure you're making migratory monarchs as opposed to non-migratory. You can measure things like chrysalis weight and things like that. Also an interesting look at September droughts. So how does that affect the population overwintering in Mexico if we have September droughts in certain areas? And key takeaways. So at left is a picture of a monarch with OE. In my experience, the monarchs, 99% of the monarchs with OE have completely healthy wings and fly perfectly well. In fact, only the flying monarchs can actually spread OE to ensure the parasite's survival. So usually these monarchs that cannot fly cannot really contribute to the OE problem. This means that all flying butterflies really should be tested for OE. So if you have a butterfly like this, you don't need to test it. But all the other ones should be tested for OE. There are other problems that affect the monarchs and that may commonly exist at the same time as OE. If you're waiting for your monarchs to look like this before you test them for OE, that would be a bad thing, since 99% of them will fly perfectly well. If we look at the geologic timescale and monarch evolution, 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was first formed, and if we look at when the protozoa started, it was about 1.5 billion years ago, which is also when the Blue Ridge Mountains started to form. And then milkweed started about 34 million years ago, and the Sierra Madre Oriental mountain chain was starting to form at 40 million years ago. So these are the two mountain chains basically that the Eastern monarchs would generally have to deal with. The Danius genus started about 5 million years ago. The actual Eastern monarch started about 1 to 2 million years ago. And we can see that the protozoa not only existed prior to the monarch, but it also coexisted for about 1 million to 2 million years. The monarch's immune system must be aware of this parasite. Rarely mentioned is the insect immune system, which they do have an immune system. Insects will combat protozoan parasites using their innate immune system, which involves both cellular and humoral responses. Of course, some parasites have also evolved to avoid those defenses. It's a battle back and forth between the host and the parasite. And of course, this equilibrium rate can change over time as the immune system may change with over time. The immune system, while pupating, the insect immune system continues to function and coordinate with the hormonal system during pupation. And hormones regulate the immune processes, ensuring that it remains active to protect the developing insect. Temperatures will affect the immune system, and sometimes decreasing the concentration of immune cells. Specific effects vary by species, with some studies showing higher temperatures increase the immune cell amounts, like in honeybees, but can decrease them in ladybugs. And some studies also show that it can cause a permanent alteration in the immune gene expression, as in the mosquito, for example. So here's an interesting factoid. Higher temperatures during a butterfly's pupal stage can significantly impair the adult immune system by reducing the concentration of key immune cells. In the butterfly, a different butterfly, those reared at higher temperatures, which is around 25 degrees C or room temperature, had a lower hemocyte count and reduced PO activity compared to butterflies that were reared at the cooler temperature of 17 degrees C, which is around 60 degrees F. Now let's take a look at the declining population of the Eastern monarch as surveyed from overwintering sites in Mexico. This is per the monarchwatch.org chart, and it spans from 1994 to present. We can see sort of a general decline over the years in terms of hectares of butterflies overwintering in Mexico. One thing that the Monarch Watch has pointed out was a difference between the 94 to 24 period and the 04 to 24 period, and a decrease of about 2 hectares. And they point out a change or step change between the overall and the more recent from since 2004. So they're sort of pointing out a step change happened in 2004. Another way to look at this data is to put it in these charts that actually show that in the overall data set, that 18.19 over here is actually an outlier. So if you're looking at the average, it's going to artificially increase that average to a higher number. With any outlier, they should really be rejected, and you should just look at the data set without that data point. And you can see the actual median is 4 acres for that data set. The median means that there's as many points, data points above this line as there are data points below this line. So it's the actual median. Here you can see the average is 5.087, and this was the average prior to including that last data point, which was about 5.08. This 18 obviously increased the average quite a bit, but if you compare the two medians of before and after, 2004, the whole data set, and then just 2004 and later, you can see the change is actually from 4 to 2.8, which is about a hectare. Or if you look at it as I had 4 hectares originally, now I only have 3, you lost 1, so you have about 25% loss from all time, if you will, to what happened after 2004. If you ask AI about OE, it tends to say that there are 2 factors that are contributing to the higher OE infection rates. And the first one mentioned is the tropical milkweed, which doesn't die back, allowing OE spores to accumulate and persist throughout the year. And the second is home rearing, which is not only the home rearing part, it's the part where it's not done to avoid OE or to make sure that OE is not released. In other words, in the first instance, you basically have localized monarch populations that are potentially affecting the migratory monarch populations by having these OE spores linger year-round. And the second part is just saying always test for OE prior to release. If your butterfly has OE, it really should not be released. There are other charts that also look at the increase in the infection rate of the migrating monarchs. Apparently, since 1968 until around the turn of the millennia, it was 1 or less than 1%, and after it was around 10%. There is a gap of data here, and it is suggested that tropical milkweed was the culprit for this change, which it may have had contributed to that, but there were also other things happening in this time frame. Tropical milkweed was actually sold by a lot of the Save the Monarch organizations as a beneficial plant. Only in 2015 was it questioned as a potential problem, but there was a lot of use, a lot of plantings during over a decade during this time period. Then we also have GMO and herbicides coming into the picture in 2004 and in 2007, and the combination of BT, which is a GMO corn, for example, and a herbicide tolerant corn, and the combination also overlaps that same time span. Tropical milkweed, unfortunately, has been recommended for over a decade, and it wasn't until 2015 that it was suspected to be harmful. And we can see the increase in herbicide tolerant crops by year and location. During that turn of the millennia, there was a huge increase in the corn fields for a lot of that herbicide tolerant Roundup Ready type seed. And you can also see the range in the application, which is fairly high in the Midwest and even fairly high at the Eastern Mason-Dixon line here. Here, the change in the corn was kind of low prior to 2000, but around 2005 really ramped up in a step change here. And the BT crops were also increasing over time during this time, and there were more and more resistant insects being created over time, because if all you have is these crops, then the insects that do survive that crop, they're going to have that natural selection where they're going to become more and more resistant to this problem. So monarchs may also have gone through to change their immune system to a certain extent where they can be more resistant to the BT. But it was obvious to the ag industry that they would have to do something, because creating resistant insects wasn't really the goal of their GMO. On this chart for corn, for example, the BT only sort of peaked in 2003. Their herbicide Roundup Ready sort of peaked in 2007 or so, and then they started using the combination of both, and that really kicked off during that time period as well, and sort of apparently is leveling out since 2018. In summary, what factors affect OE infection rate? Of course, an increase in OE spores in the environment. So anything that makes OE spores linger longer than they should, like tropical milkweed, like home rearing without testing for OE, those two factors will increase the OE spores in the environment. The other factor would be the depression of the caterpillar's immune system, which would likely be affected by things like GMO, the BT, and the herbicide-tolerant crops, probably home rearing using a lot of shade as opposed to what their natural habitat would entail. Of course, an increase in things like chlorine and fluoride when you're doing home rearing, as you use tap water, for example, to keep the milkweed hydrated, and an exposure to room temperature in home rearing that may actually reduce the immune system activity. So you may be affecting the immune system, making it weaker by exposing the caterpillar to room temperatures. Another factor that might actually help OE grow in the caterpillars is moisture issues. If you have a step change in moisture in September, for example, like if you look at the dew point average for the month, and September is the month in which the migratory generation is being formed, you can see that probably your food supply is going to have more black sooty mold, is going to have more pseudomonas on the milkweed, which would make it more susceptible to mold, and which may also weaken the immune system to an extent where OE starts reappearing. And mold may be a cofactor enhancing OE infection rates. Another factor is that a particular generation, the one that goes through diapause, may be more susceptible to infection than the other generations due to the coevolution of the parasite over the millennia. The parasite may have been fine-tuned to really infect that generation that goes through diapause, as opposed to other generations that do not go through diapause. Interestingly enough, there is not a gender-specific susceptibility when dealing with OE. We'll take a look at that data. So this was an interesting chart that showed, for example, on August 4th, 2025, they noticed that July in Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri was fairly humid, and they pulled some data. The National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration pulled some data together, and they showed that the 30-year mean dew point temperature for July from the period of 1991 to 2020, for example, in Iowa, it would be between 63 and 67 degrees F, which is about the same as it would be here on the eastern Mason-Dixon line. But for the month of July 2025, the picture had changed pretty radically, so that all these red areas that were fairly low, fairly southern, really creeped up all the way up to the southern tip of Iowa, and as well all the way up to the Mason-Dixon line. What used to be normal for July, everything, the dew point was generally would stay under 67. For July 2025, the dew point was above 67. So there was a step change for the month of July. Now you might ask yourself, okay, what about September? How does that look? Could it be possible that there is a similar step change for the monarchs that are the migratory monarchs? I took a look at some data and pulled the average moisture dew point over time for my local area, which is basically the Eastern Mason-Dixon line. And you could see from 1948 to about 1974, there was a certain range of dew points. And then there was sort of a dry period where the dew point remained below 55 up until 95. And then in 96, there was a step change where the dew point was always above 55. So in 96, there was sort of a radical change that the old population 20 years prior was completely different from the new population. And you can sort of see the three populations here in terms of bar chart. When there's very little overlap between these two data sets, it kind of shows a sort of a radical step change. So there is a radical step change in 96 in moisture. And if you look at the same data with temperature, you can see the same trend where the average September temperature was always below 65. And then after 96, the average temperature for September was always above 65. That step change is interesting because the monarch watch charts only start around this period forward. Here is another interesting chart, which was called the nuke effect slow. The nuclear plant was right here and emitting stacks of steam, and you could see that the snowfall would fall in this narrow line here. About 30 miles out, there was an extra inch of snow where everywhere else there was no particular snow. So you can see how something like a nuclear plant stack can change the weather in a 30-mile radius here if we're talking about snow. Of course, if it's not cold enough to drop it into the ground as snow, it could travel much further than 30 miles. In trying to explain that delta T in 1996, one of the explanations is probably a nuclear plant, and that started up in 96. And the other explanation is there were such a thing as a valley that reaches from the Tennessee Valley all the way up to sort of the Eastern Mason-Dixon line here. And there's sort of this funneling of air that goes down this funnel, and that doesn't really mix with the air around it. That could explain why, if you're on the Eastern Mason-Dixon line, generally you're subject to the moisture from the ocean or Chesapeake Bay, but when the wind prevalence is such that the wind is blowing from the west and you're getting this valley air coming through, this may have been what increased the moisture level of that air in the month of September, which generally the prevailing winds are coming up this way through this valley. there's some interesting wind rose charts for airports where you can see the prevailing winds. And this may be a channel that the monarchs use to migrate northward. I don't think they use this channel to return because it would be too difficult, as the winds, the prevalent winds may be working against them. So when they come back down, they're probably coming back down on the other side of the these Blue Ridge Mountains down this way. So let's look at the data for the 2025 OE season. This is, for example, every day the number of E-closed butterflies and the number of OE butterflies. Of course, when you start in July, everything is perfect. There's no OE, and but that doesn't last long. There generally starts to be some OE appearing in the month of August, and here you can see out of the 10 butterflies, one of them was infected. On the next day, out of the 10, one was infected. On the next day, out of the 18, one was infected. And then on the following days, there was no infected butterflies. And then on the 10th, we start seeing a trickle coming in through here. And it's sort of trickling through until near the end of August, where there's a couple large numbers of OE coming through. At first there's none, which is great, and it would be great if the whole season would happen that way. But at some point the OE is going to start trickling in. Here you can sort of clearly see that if you only have 1 out of the 10 that is infected, and they all ate generally the same leaves, the only way you can think about why there was one that was infected, there's only 2 possibilities. One is there were only 3 eggs that were laid that were infected, and those 3 were the ones that became infected. And of course, that butterfly that laid those 3 eggs didn't infect any of the other leaves or anything like that. So that would be one possibility. And then the other possibility would be that they all ate infected leaves, but only one of them had an immune system that wasn't able to manage the OE infection out of the 10 on this day, the 10 on this day, and the 18 on that day. My belief is that yes, the immune system is starting to suppress the OE here. There seems to be evidence that if the immune system couldn't handle that all, why wouldn't they all be infected? But there's always a ratio of infection, generally. Of course, there's no ratio when you start off, but as more infected monarchs come into your area, then you're going to start seeing these numbers increase. My theory is that the caterpillar's immune system needs to be tip-top shape, and in order to do that, it needs to see some daily direct sun like it would in the wild. Usually, if you could do 1 to 2 hours around noon. Of course, if you have molting or jays, they should always be kept in the deep shade and never be exposed to the sunlight. To do it on sunny days, there's really no sense in doing it on overcast days. It's also ideal to expose them to temperatures that are good for their immune system, to maximize their immune system, especially when they're molting or pupating. Now, I used to think that was greater than 72 degrees, but I'm starting to think this may be actually in the 60s. I'm going to have to do some tests to compare sort of those two temperature ranges and see what happens. Also feed fresh dark leaves. Now dark leaves, they're spinach color and they don't have any mold on them. That would be ideal. Avoid restricted food supply or overcrowding. If they run out of food, that's probably a stress event for them, which reduces their immune system. If they're overcrowded and they are fighting over the food, then that is also a stress event. So it's best to try and only have 10 per cage if you can manage that, so they're not overly stressed with the food supply. Oxygen levels be as high as possible, no restrictions in airflow. It's good to have sort of a cage where the carbon monoxide or dioxide can drop down below the caterpillars and it doesn't accumulate in their cage. And then you have nice airflow beneath them as well for frass, for drying out frass or other things that drop down below. Of course, you want to avoid dumpster diving or contaminating the food with the frass. So you should have a method by which the frass can drop down below the food level. And prevent them from, if they're running out of food, they will go down and try to reprocess that frass, and that's another thing you want to definitely avoid. Don't use rainwater for milkweed cuttings whenever you're trying to keep the milkweed from wilting. The season's fairly short. You have July, you have August, and then September you're starting to get your migratory monarchs. This is where the light changes to a ratio that will trigger the migratory monarchs. So you don't have a lot of time to build up generations prior to that generation. Here is the data on a daily basis, and you can see the percent OE as it builds over time. So here's the 50% mark. And ideally, you know, in July you have 0% OE, everything's perfect. And you can have 100% OE free monarchs. And then there's that trickle in coming in. And then you see it really start to dive below 50%. And then if you take certain actions, you can try and get it back up above the 50% line. On August 10th, I did see a weather-beat female in the patch and let her go do her thing. She seemed fairly desperate to lay a bunch of eggs, so I let her do that. But I'm thinking that, you know, this may have been a problem. She may have been a source of a lot of OE infection. This is where one monarch can really make a big difference. If you know that there is OE, if the monarch is infected, it's best not to release that infected female because there are many generations that are going to be affected in even the migratory generation. You can also see in gray the buildup of all the generations of monarchs being released up to 566. And, you know, that seems like a lot of butterflies, but you're really not, you're only doing this to get to the migratory monarchs. The supers, as is labels here, the supers, cumulative, that are coming out, they're basically trickling in very slow rate in August and then really building up in September as they come through. So it's very modest amount of the migratory monarchs coming through here. Looking by gender, they're fairly equal opportunity. Males and females are almost equal at every stage of the game. Even the migratory, the males and females are equally susceptible. There is no particular gender that is more susceptible to OE. There are many other things that can be confused with OE, and here are some ideas, and won't go through them all, but here are some possible issues confounded with OE. One of them is missing clause. There's this little V at the end that should be there, and if it's missing, then it will make it very difficult for the butterfly to eclose normally. Here's a quick note about bleaching leaves for OE, and I'm not a proponent of bleaching the leaves. I think it's better to keep all the antioxidants that are there intact for the caterpillars, and it's better to remove the infected monarchs at the end of the system here. And it's also good to always test your bleach solution that you're using, because it can suddenly degrade. A quick note about the cages: ideally use metal powder coated mesh cages so that the sunlight can actually reach the caterpillar's skin, and there's a high airflow. Of course, the silk trails that caterpillars leave on surfaces can be a problem, so be sure to wipe that off with vinegar prior to bleaching the cages. And again, always test your solution to make sure that if you're bleaching your cage, that you're actually destroying the spores. If it's too weak, it may not actually do anything to the spores. Here is a way to ensure that you are making that generation that you want of migratory butterflies. Here I only started this graph around September 1st when I knew the bigger butterflies were coming out, and I don't have much data on the other side of this, but they're probably less than a gram. The Chrysalis are probably less than a gram on a regular non-migratory butterfly, and they should increase to be around 1.3 grams per chrysalis. And you're sure you're feeding them appropriately. And then I found a paper that showed some weights for the chrysalis, and it also showed a mean of 1.3 grams, so that's a good reference point. Also, about the supers or the migratory generation, they kind of trickle in over time. They don't necessarily, it's not like a switch gets turned on and it's like no more of the non-migratory and only the migratory. No, it's kind of a hormonal change, so it's a very gradual thing that comes in, and sometimes you'll still have the others coming in, so you can see how much the hormones play a role in all this. And you have to be very careful not to upset the hormonal system to create the wrong kind of butterflies in September, for example. Here's just an example of a cage with some chrysalis, and you can weigh the cage, and if you know the tar weight, you can say, okay, I have 6 grams of chrysalids on this cage. If I know I have 9 of them, you can divide and you can get the per chrysalis weight, and this is on the low side. So you obviously want to have chrysalis, one of their supers, to be around 1.3, about twice as big as these. Here's another example of the cage system. They're 6 by 6 and 2 inches tall. You can add sort of a 1-inch extension here so that when they eclose, their wings can expand fully, especially on the migratory ones. Just to be safe, it's better to just put 2 cages butting against each other so that you have that 4-inch of space. And if they drop down, they can climb back up because there's a lot of the mesh here that allows them to do that. Here's an example of a monarch that had probably taconid fly larvae in it. There's 4 dead ones. So this one had problems emerging. And you can see it didn't really change the size of the wings at all from when it was inside the chrysalis. So there was absolutely zero expansion of the wings. When the chrysalis was removed, found these little dead larvae in there, 4 of them. And they were dark, so maybe they were mold infected, or maybe the immune system took care of it. But either way, it might have done enough damage to prevent the monarch from eclosing like it should. So, and that's the idea. You want to maximize the immune system so that the monarch can take care of these problems. So the key takeaways is really to boost the immune system as much as possible so the monarch can handle any predators and parasites. So the fewer monarchs with OE that are released, the better chances for future generations of monarchs to build the immunity and the resistance to OE. So we're not close to having a season with 0 OE, although that would be great. The goal is not to overwhelm the immune system, but to trigger it to manage the low infection rates. The ultimate goal is to release a large number of OE-resistant migratory monarchs to overwinter in Mexico to help future generations be more resistant to OE. So for 2025, about 130 to 150 OE-resistant migratory monarchs will be released. The key takeaway is always test for OE. To remove the OE-infected monarchs so that the remaining generations become more OE-resistant, and to avoid an endemic OE situation like Florida, for example. Mold may interfere with wing expansion. Mold should be a careful consideration, and it may be present many times that OE is present as well when the immune system is compromised. And it may not be the OE parasite per se that prevents the normal expansion of the wings. It could be mold infection doing that. Remember, 99.9% of monarchs with OE have perfectly formed wings. Lastly, I took a look at the drought situation versus the population. And you can go to the drought site and basically look at year over year to see how the drought situation is. And there's some years where it's really bad, like Texas is in 2011, and you can see the Midwest in 2012. They were really bad years. And you can see that reflected a little bit in the population, where we have these 2 down years, and then you have 2 really low years as well, because droughts have a legacy effect, and they can have lasting effects even though the drought is no longer happening. You can also see that the 2003-2004 time period is 2003 is nearly no drought whatsoever in the range, and then 2004 is also sort of in that range, and those seem to be more on the good years of this, and it doesn't seem to explain why it would be so low in 2004 here, which tends to again point to another factor affecting these monarchs. Also, in September 2023, there are 2 states that were pretty bad. When you think of the monarchs migrating in September and they have to cross over 2 states that are having a drought, it might be a little more difficult than having to cross 1 state that is having a really big drought. But this may also have a legacy effect, so that it would have affected 2 and 3 years after the fact, because remember, not only is it a drought in September, but this probably affects the new growth in the spring for the spring migration.